Alright, so today we're going to be talking about our second architect biography, Charles Rennie Mackintosh, this very quite famous architect from Scotland that kind of established the first non-traditional Scottish style of architecture. So sit back, take some notes, and enjoy this kind of life story and work highlights of Charles Rennie Mackintosh, one of my favorite architects from the British Isles. So Charles Rennie Mackintosh grew up in Glasgow in Scotland, which is kind of in the southwest of Scotland. But when he was a young adult in 1884, so he would have been 18, 19, he didn't have enough money to properly enroll in a college, in a university. So he started attending evening classes at the old Glasgow School of Art, that building that we talked about in the arts and crafts lectures that he had rebuilt. You can imagine it used to be a very antiquated, very traditional Scottish architectural school. And after only 2 years of attending these evening classes, he was doing so well in his projects, even winning national draft competitions, that he was given new opportunities in these architecture classes. He became eventually an apprentice to the established Glasgow architect John Hutchinson, and soon became a draughtsman for the architectural firm Honey and Keppie, which he impressed his superiors with his dignified and very innovative understanding on historical styles. This was truly the Beaux Arts era, and historical revival monuments still defined architecture in the 1880s. The prize money from his awards from these competitions enabled him to make a tour of Italy in 1891, as a lot of the famous architects in Europe do. He kept a diary during his tour and produced massive drawings and watercolors that would later kind of aid him in his architectural endeavors in his later life. But during the 1890s, he kind of began to expand out from architecture, getting inspired with the arts and crafts movement going on in England. I mean, he began to work more freely as an artist, producing sketches, producing watercolors, producing posters, furniture, and craft work, which would cause him to kind of develop this very unique style that he later integrated into his architecture. He was obsessed with organic images loaded with symbolism. It wasn't long before Mackintosh made some lifelong friends at his art school. So Mackintosh became very good friends, in particular with these three certain students at his art school. You can see a picture of them up at the top of this slide, one of which he would eventually marry, Margaret, who heavily contributed to his later architectural and craft designs. So these four together, the three and Mackintosh, were all in turn heavily influenced by the director of their school, Francis Newberry, who was very much an advocate of William Morris and of the arts and crafts movement going on to the south of them in England. So these four called themselves fittingly the Four, and in their class projects initially developed this kind of very decorative style influenced by Japanese wood prints, so taking a cue from a little bit from the Art Nouveau, but also the English arts and crafts medievalist artworks combined with their own heritage in Scotland, so Scottish art. Specifically, they were inspired by the gaunt-looking Celtic art in medieval manuscripts, in Scottish medieval manuscripts, with its folk art and twisting plant forms, and you can see a couple of examples to the right hand of the slide. Their subject matter often included Celtic mythology and medieval fairy tales, but this was done in an extraordinarily stylized way, where space was symmetrically filled with elongated humans and native Scottish plant forms. So the four eventually turned this into this kind of pseudo business, and they took on commissions for furniture, for graphic posters, and for stained glass projects for window installations. They got some positive reviews of their work appearing in magazines, but most were unfavorable. The world really wasn't ready for this style. They often depicted haunting, gaunt, elongated figures and lovers entwined. British critics were scandalized by their art and called objects created by the four ghoulish and hideous. Where their work was seen in British and Scottish circles, they were often mocked as the spook school. In the early 1890s, Mackintosh had an increasingly larger hand in creating many buildings for Honey and Keppie. These included the Glasgow Herald in 1984 and the Daily Record in 1901, both newspaper offices. We can see at least even here that he drew heavily upon his drawings of traditional Scottish baronial castles and buildings. He was fascinated by the round towers, the gable walls, and the way that the windows were often not symmetrically positioned, and already it's very clear he was striving to create a Scottish freestyle, inspired by the English freestyle. His undoubted influence of elongated human and plant forms can be seen on the many decorated elements of carved brick or brass door handles. But the commission that really began Mackintosh's career was a redesign for his beloved Glasgow School of Art, which we talked about a couple lectures ago, but I'm going to go more into depth here in this lecture. So this was a competition commission, as I said, held in 1896 for young architects to submit proposals for a new design. Mackintosh was a favorite of the teachers and the director, so he already kind of had a foot in. He of course in the end won the competition, and his designs for the building inside and out would catapult his career. Much of Mackintosh's inspiration for his design came from his sketching tours involving, as I say, traditional Scottish buildings, so castles and baronial estates. The original budget only covered the cost of half the planned building, and as the building was rebuilt, sections that had been completed seemed to 19th century eyes to lack symmetry or logic. The east facade looked like an ancient Scottish castle. It was deeply unpopular while under construction. A half-finished building was unveiled to a disaffected Glasgow in 1899, and the project was halted. Cannot stop at this point. He must get on with his career and redeem his reputation, but in several years he would return to finish the Glasgow School of Art. And I just want to show you this picture just to give you some context of what downtown Glasgow looked like, and largely still kind of looks like today. It's these very neoclassical facades, kind of like Edinburgh, a little bit of Gothic, but a lot of historical revivals. And so the taste of Glasgow when they saw Mackintosh's new building in the art school, they weren't ready for it. The world wasn't ready for this kind of symbolic, stripped down Scottish freestyle. Mackintosh's first complete project on his own that really allowed him to explore his aesthetic and rally his career, like many architects, was a church. In 1897, at 28 years old, Mackintosh began work on the Queen's Cross in Glasgow for the Free Church of Scotland of his own volition, while still working under his firm. He designed the building and its interior furnishings. It is built of red sandstone with these sharp, energetic, modern, industrial-looking vertical planes to complement Glasgow's industrial nature, yet with these simplified Gothic windows, though with kind of unusual tracery inspired by elongated platforms. And if you look at the tracery of normal Gothic churches, you'll see how this differs. The interior contains this wealth of organic-looking carved detail and symbolism inspired by his work with the forest, so these kind of elongated gaunt forms. He used elongated bird and plant motifs to kind of very cleverly symbolize Christian ideas and theology. So you can see here at the bottom right, he's got the pulpit, and on the pulpit he has this very stylized dove representing the Holy Spirit, and under it these young shoots sprouting up based on Jesus' parable of the seeds. It all looked very biological, but interestingly there were no crosses to be found. Now this is really interesting. Mackintosh's early views on architecture regarding churches were expressed in a lecture he gave at the Glasgow Institute. He said that old architecture lived because it had a purpose. Modern architecture, to be real, must not be an envelope without contents. In his lecture, he's very much at pains to convey how ridiculous it looks that modern churches, modern banks, and modern museums were designed as imitations of Greek temples. He says, "We must clothe modern ideas with modern dress. We shall have designs by living men for living men." There's this idea that we need to be able to celebrate and advocate for modern technology and ideas through architecture, not simply resign ourselves to say the past was so much better, so much prettier, with no attempt to create a renaissance of our own time. And so Mackintosh and a lot of the other turn of the century architects are starting to think this way, and they're really the first ones that are starting to think this way at the turn of the century. But this idea is really the beating heart of modern architecture. So here we come, we're at this point where you're going to look at a lot of the buildings that I'm going to teach you in the next few classes, and you're going to think, this looks way more modern than the date. This looks like it could have been built in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, but no, it was built in 1900. And this is something you got to understand about modern architecture. It goes way farther back than it appears, than you think, which is why this class exists. What we would call modern architecture already has more than 100 years of history. So here in this house, Mackintosh finally got to truly experiment with, as he would say, designs by living men for living men in his first major domestic commission, this house called the Windy Hill House in Kilmacolm. So this was a private house designed for a very wealthy Glasgow grocer named William Davidson that soon became one of Mackintosh's most loyal patrons, not just for houses but for furniture and art as well. It was to be built on a rich country estate just west of Glasgow, and it was built from 1900 to 1901. So with its pitched roofs, its very plain appearance, its disunited windows, and especially its sort of tower form outcroppings, Mackintosh was truly trying to establish a Scottish freestyle from the Scottish baronial of his native country. And this estate itself would have been surrounded by Scottish baronial estates. At a glance, it looks like it could have been sitting in the Scottish landscape for 500 years. Mackintosh has placed the traditional appearance and layout of a 16th century cottage house and accelerated it towards the 20th century. The rough grey plaster walls remind you of a Scottish castle. The enclosed staircases remind you of the castle's round tower, yet one updated for an age of modernism. Inside too, you're sort of slipping in and out of history. Mackintosh has designed the interior like castles and baronial estates, which is very insulated from the Scottish winter, with very thick walls. The windows are very small too and placed very sparsely, often changing in size. It seems like a very well and insulated, well protected Scottish castle. There are exposed wooden beams and paneling that give a sense of warmth. There are baronial banqueting halls to entertain guests which feel very cozy and have this very secure sense of intimacy. Glimpses of these, subtle medievalisms are everywhere, in the panels of stained glass, in the swirling tendril forms which recall Celtic knots, in the hanging lanterns, all sort of stylistically updated into Mackintosh's 20th century language, which he learned from his furniture work with the Four. Much of the furniture made by Mackintosh, also commissioned for a previous home, was moved here, but his interiors weren't 100% integrated with his exteriors yet, apart from some rooms. Mackintosh also here begins to experiment with his iconic look in furniture. He's got this elongated furniture, he's got Japanese-inspired carpentry, which you kind of saw in the Glasgow School of Art. He's got Japanese-inspired lantern lights, much like the ones used by other arts and crafts artists, like Gustav Stickley, if you remember. But these were all forms Mackintosh began to experiment with here to integrate, simple modern crafts into simplified modern vernacular architecture. Because remember, at this point, he's still very much an arts and crafts architect. He hasn't really transitioned into the Art Nouveau with the rest of Europe quite yet. So when Charles Rennie Mackintosh and his now wife, Margaret MacDonald, married in 1900, they moved into a certain flat in Glasgow where Mackintosh completely redesigned the interiors to his aesthetic, ripping out the old sort of Victorian interiors, which was this project that really helped him formulate his interior aesthetic for future projects and really set down his style and provided an opportunity for him to experiment with furniture, with wallpaper, with interior design. So together with Margaret, he developed very distinctive color schemes of white and gray, and stenciled friezes of plant forms, colored gas lights, and tendril furniture. He also filled their home with inventive elongated furniture designs, which, you'll see these later on in all of his buildings, these very sort of alien looking elongated furniture. But their home became basically nothing less than a work of art to live in. This was a world away from fashions of the time, if you can imagine, which called for heavy oak furniture, picture frames, and velvet drapes. Many visitors were, very struck by the intense alien atmosphere of these interiors. His furniture design soon attracted an international cult following. Many said his rooms made them want to pace quietly and gather their thoughts, or they felt as if they were in a refreshing sacred space, despite the fact that having a room with totally white furniture and white walls was seen as totally radical at this point. The dark rooms represented the masculine areas in which Mackintosh might dwell. They had heavy colors and right-angled designs, while the light rooms represented the feminine. They were full of these delicate plant designs that invited a sort of purity and intimacy, and massive frescoes of stylized long-haired women painted by Margaret and Mackintosh. They were created using fragments of string and glass beads and tin inlaid into gesso. So the surface of the gesso would have been painted and then inlaid with bits of pearl, bits of glass paste, and bits of precious stones, all kind of linked between these swirling threads and painted over with gesso again. This absolutely created the most unique and beautiful wall art of the entire Art Nouveau movement, and Mackintosh would later use these designs in retail spaces he was hired to decorate, like his famous tea houses around Glasgow. So, Mackintosh's signature architectural and decorative style really began to be celebrated in his entry for this sort of international competition for, as it's called, the design of a house for an art lover in Germany, which took place in 1901 for this sort of German aristocrat that hired a bunch of Art Nouveau artists to compete to design his house. So actually, Mackintosh's entry was disqualified for ignoring many of the requirements, so it was never actually built on this German aristocrat's estate. But we have the drawings here, and the judges actually very highly praised his work, this kind of up-and-coming architect from backwater Scotland, for its cohesiveness of inner and outer construction, right? The interior decor matched the exterior architecture, and it was used as a portfolio piece throughout his life. But this building does exist today. It was finally built in reality all the way back in Glasgow between 1989 and 1996, so almost 100 years after this competition took place. Mackintosh wasn't alive anymore, but you can go and visit it, the idea of it. But there's evidence that his wife had a big influence in the interior design at this competition and throughout the rest of his works. It's thought that she designed the drawing on the left, the music room, with its elaborate fusion of what they called, Mackintosh and his wife, male and female shapes. So, in female spaces and female rooms where women were supposed to hang out, curvilinear female forms dominated, and you had very light colors, very pastel colors, very light whitewashed colors. And then in the male rooms, as I said, in Mackintosh and Margaret's apartment, you have these sort of bold, right-angled, upright structures, these bold and dark colors. But the two aesthetics came together in the music room because it is where male and female spaces united, where the men of the house and the women of the house came together for entertainment, right? So, many at the competition realized this as the first building in which is not found, as they would say, a trace of the conventional forms of architecture and furniture. But of course, most at the competition were sort of bewildered by the strangeness of it and found it very distasteful. It's important to remember that while, we're praising Mackintosh in this lecture, Mackintosh really wasn't the most popular architect during his life, which is why during his whole life, he hardly ever got out of Scotland. He hardly got any commissions outside of Scotland. Now, Hill House, which you see here, was the largest and most complex of Mackintosh's domestic commissions. It was built for the famous Glasgow children's book publisher Walter Blackie, a fan of Mackintosh's work. As the story goes, one day he arrived at Windy Hill, which we just talked about, and decided he wanted one of his own, only bigger and better. He insisted that Mackintosh should spend time with the family before designing the house, so Mackintosh indeed spent time living with the Blackies to ensure the house functioned around their needs, but the overall artistic vision was entirely his. It was truly the first exterior-interior integrated house in Mackintosh's built portfolio. It was situated among the traditional houses of Glasgow's businessmen. The exterior was, as mentioned, one of simplicity and grey rough plaster. Mackintosh wrote that he wanted to design an abstract building that did not resemble an English mansion, an Italian villa, a Swiss chalet, or even a Scottish castle, but merely a dwelling house, true to its form in the Scottish freestyle, not trying to be anything else. The result was a house very lightly resembling a Scottish baronial estate, stripped down of every frill and ornament and covered in rough plaster, a staggered mass of traditional baronial 19th century Scottish architectural elements like round towers, like steep roofs, like flat facades broken up by square windows, and a liberal amount of rectangular chimneys. As in the Mackintosh house, squares of rectangles in line contrast with the softness of plant forms in different rooms throughout the house, coordinating with the light and dark theme of the masculine and feminine spaces. There are characteristic Mackintosh stencil patterns, sculptures, furniture, and stained glass on every inch of the home. Since it's a country house, all the decor is about nature, so that all of the halls are lined with these very abstract stencil pattern representations of flowers. Mackintosh designed some of his best interiors in the late Victorian Glasgow tea rooms of Argyle Street, Buchanan Street, and Ingram Street. Miss Cranston, their owner, was a generous patron for Mackintosh, allowing him to enjoy unprecedented artistic freedom with these commissions. Mackintosh drew on the imagery of the four very heavily in his tea room designs, with their tree-like forms, tall stylized women, and rose motifs. In 1903, Miss Cranston asked Mackintosh to recreate from scratch her willow tea rooms in Glasgow. Mackintosh rebuilt the exterior facade and used screens and galleries to create these sophisticated internal spaces with stenciled friezes and stained glass mirrors and a new line of furniture. The front of the tea room was decorated in white, silver, and rose, while the rear luncheon room was dark and masculine, separating the feminine and masculine dining spaces. And this is actually one of the best preserved Mackintosh buildings still existing in Glasgow. It looks almost exactly like the pictures you see here still today. All the furniture is original, a lot of the decorations are original. So if you ever get the chance to go to Glasgow, I would highly recommend giving this a visit. You can still sit down, have breakfast, and drink tea, just like Miss Cranston's patrons all the way back in 1903. So as I said in the beginning of the lecture, we would get back to the Glasgow School of Art and how Mackintosh eventually saved his reputation and finished it at the height of his career. So Mackintosh, at the height of his career, reinvested his energy into the Mackintosh School of Art with the wisdom he had gained throughout several years of successful commissions. The existing east facade resembled one of Mackintosh's baronial castles. The new west facade would be very new and different, with a trio of slender oriel windows. It would be more linear, more geometric. Behind the new windows was the new library, this space where Mackintosh's style took a massive leap forward. He designed it in a sort of compromise between the alien-looking Art Nouveau and the Stickley-esque arts and crafts, with mortise and tendon joint, internal balconies and verandas encircling the room, with a central courtyard like a Japanese residence. The furniture recalled Stickley's mortise and tendon joint structures in its basic wooden forms, but also Mackintosh's experiments in the Art Nouveau aesthetic, with his signature leaded windows and craft lamps. Now you'll notice the space is very dark and masculine, reflecting the majority male population of the university. intended to use this space. After this, when Mackintosh was 42 years old, he was described as having a satanic personality. He drank a lot and often exploded into violent fits of rage and nervous breakdowns. Clients became very wary of his reputation for being difficult. World War I had begun and Europe went into recession. With no buildings to be built, Mackintosh and his wife moved to London to a shabby apartment where he returned to his first love, painting scenes of nature as his and his wife's funds dried up. He began writing to his friends and old clients asking for small amounts of money. After designing the interior of a small flat in 1916, he never designed another building or made another piece of furniture. Outside of a small band of supporters, he was a nobody again. In 1923, Charles and Margaret decided to escape to the south of France. They lived a humble Mediterranean life. Mackintosh became a landscape painter. He described these years as the happiest years of his life. Soon, however, he returned to London having developed mouth cancer from pipe smoking, and his tongue was surgically removed. He died in Hampstead, where he had moved with his wife in 1928 at 60 years old. Margaret outlived him by only 5 years. He asked for his ashes to be scattered near their old home in southern France, where he had been the happiest. Mackintosh needs to be remembered as an artist of global significance. Even though he was forgotten in his own lifetime, his ideas were mirrored and developed by others all across Europe and America, as we'll see. Mackintosh was all about designing buildings that were informed by their environment and the context and the history of the place they were built.